I want to welcome you all to ICA, and I want to welcome everyone to this timely conversation about Maia and Josephine's project, Look at Art, Get Paid. But before we begin, I want to bring to your attention a few upcoming programs that we have. Tomorrow from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m., we are hosting Mindfulness at the Museum, which is a series of drop-in guided meditation sessions with an art-centric approach to mental health. Friday's session will be facilitated by Shashina Bray. Next week, we have a number of programs. On Tuesday, March 12th, artist Tony Orsler will present a screening of a film project that he worked on with Tony Conrad titled The Most Interesting Man Alive. The program is in conjunction with introducing Tony Conrad, a retrospective, which is currently on view in our first floor gallery. The screening is a joint program with Lightbox Film Center, where the event will be held. On Wednesday at 6 p.m., Assistant ICA Curator Megan Lee will lead guests on a tour of her exhibition, Color People Time, Mundane Futures, which is located in the back gallery space on the third floor. Positioned next to Mundane Futures is Cecilia Vicuña's exhibition titled About to Happen. For more information on these programs, our exhibitions, and our other ICA events, please visit our website. Now I want to bring to the podium Stephanie Bersesi, the program coordinator for Haverford College's Philadelphia Area Creative Collaboratives, also known as PACC. Thank you. That's a lot of C's in there, but thank you.
Wrote that just so you had to. James is super tall. Hello. Hi. My name is Stephanie Bersesi, and I just want to tell you a little bit about the PACC program and a tiny bit about this PACC project that Maia and Josephine were part of, as well as some of the other collaborators. So the Philadelphia Area Creative Collaboratives program is a grant-funded program at Haverford College, funded by the Mellon Foundation, situated inside of the Hereford Center for Arts and Humanities. So it's a 3-year kind of a pilot program that really brings together nonprofits, artists, and Haverford faculty and courses into conversation around relevant topics to those classes, to those nonprofits, and to those artists. This particular group consisted of Maia Chao and Josephine Devin Boo as our lead artists, and then Professor Craig Borowiak, who is a professor of political science, and then John Muse, who is a professor of visual studies at Haverford, and then Jamila Medley, who is the executive director of the Philadelphia Area Cooperative Alliance. And Jamila has a really interesting role in Philadelphia, is that she is an alliance that is across many different cooperatives, so from sex workers to migrant laborers, urban gardens, food co-ops. And so she helped us think a lot about really the title of the project, which is called After Work, Seeing Race in Grassroots Economies. And so we kind of looked across all of these various collaborators to talk a lot about what is already embedded in Maia and Josephine's practice. Look at Art, Get Paid, in their project, Look at Art, Get Paid. So tonight, I just want to introduce Maia, Josephine, and Carol Zou, who we are so lucky to have here. Tell you a little bit about Maia. Maia Chao is an interdisciplinary artist whose work uses existing institutions and their systems as sites of intervention, critique, and resistance. As a child, she spent 10 years of her life working at a fictional store named Harlan's as Ebony Cheffa, her alter ego, an exceedingly normal cashier. Working in video, performance, sculpture, and social practice, she tends toward absurdity and play as revolutionary tools for collaboration and collective imaging. Before coming to art, she studied cultural anthropology with a focus on indigenous media. Residencies include the Fine Arts Work Center Fellowship in Provincetown, Mass., and Pioneer Works in Brooklyn, New York, forthcoming. Chao is developing a commission for the inaugural opening of The Shed in New York City. Currently, she is a Van Leer Fellow of the Asian American Arts Alliance, a Fulbright grantee. Chao holds a BA from Brown University and an MFA from the Rhode Island School of Design. Josephine Devin Boo is an artist working against the systematic devaluing of knowledge that lives outside whiteness, affluence, and Western science. Sculpture and painting offer her a way to begin to grasp epistemic violence by playing it in slow-mo, while social practice opens the possibility of staging reversals to dominant flows of knowledge and capital. On a daily basis, it is within her relationships, from those with collaborators, artist friends, and partner institutions, to intimate partners, and housemates, where the work of learning how to begin to hold her community's truths take place. Josephine coordinates research development at the Rhode Island School of Design. She is the first artist to serve on Brown University's Institutional Review Board for Research Ethics. She holds a BFA in painting from Rhode Island School of Design and a BA in Science and Technology Studies from Brown University. And certainly not least, but last, Carol. Carol Zou is an artist, writer, educator, and cultural organizer who has worked for over a decade on the relationship between arts, culture, community, and activism. Notable projects include Yarn Bombing Los Angeles, Michaelada Think Tank, and Translation Vickery Meadow. Carol received her BFA from Cornell University with minors in urban planning and gender studies and her MFA in public practice from Otis College of Art and Design. She has participated in fellowships and residencies from Intercultural Leadership Institute, National Art Strategies, Women's Center for Creative Work, Common Field, University of Chicago Place Lab, Rebuild Foundation, and University of Houston College of the Arts Project Row Houses. Please join me in welcoming our three amazing guests.
We'd like to start by acknowledging that we are gathered here this evening on occupied Lenape land, in an institution, UPenn, and the ICA, and within a city, Philadelphia, whose founding wealth are inextricably tied to the transatlantic slave trade.
Yeah, thank you for that.
And I will just quickly thank Stephanie and James, as well as Liz here, Liz Barr, who helped us coordinate this event, as well as Derek, who's dealing with the media. So thank you.
All right, so I had the great pleasure of meeting Maia and Josephine and getting to know their project a little bit at open engagement at the Queens Museum last year. But I'm sure everyone else in the audience wants to know how they can look at art and get paid. So
we'll try, hopefully when you leave, you'll get a better idea for that. But yeah, basically a brief intro before we screen a video about the project. So critique is a hallmark of the field of art, and yet for us, Josephine and I came together thinking about how art critics, curators, museum leadership, interpreters are really dominated by white affluent folks. And so our question in coming together was, what is critique without diversity, and how can we stage an instance where we might bring in those important voices and distinct perspectives. So Look at Art Get Paid basically pays people who don't visit art museums to come to them as art critics and critics of the institution. And for us, we're interested in what truths and possibilities might be left out of dominant narratives. So what we'll do now is screen a video of the pilot, which we did at the RISD Museum in 2016, and then we'll talk about sort of where we are, the implications of the project, and also where we are, where we're going. So yeah, we can screen the video now.
I think people with money, they do museums. They have a certain way, a certain culture. They get into the museum. People in our community, we wasn't taught by our parents, like, go to the museum. Mm-hmm. It was either go to the library, go to school. We were limited what we could do. And as growing up, I guess it goes from that generation down, and maybe it's because it wasn't advertised. Who knows? I would have never had that opportunity to take my grandson. So maybe he'll remember that. Maybe he wants to go again, and that's something that he could be educated in, and he could teach his family.
Art promises to bring about change, but many art institutions still serve the elite. Museums receive public money to serve the public, but they hear from and answer to the people who show up, a small segment of the population that doesn't reflect the whole. To truly serve the public, museums must understand what their galleries feel like to the demographic majority outside their current visitor base. It turns out, this isn't easy. Free days aren't enough to bring in new voices. Studies show they usually serve people who already visit museums. Beyond the admission fee, a trip to a museum can incur transportation, food, and childcare expenses, alongside the opportunity cost of time diverted from work or leisure. This is a lot to ask, especially if you're not sure what you find in the museum will reflect your lived experience or heritage. Look at Art, Get Paid is an arts research program that pays people who rarely, if ever, go to art museums to visit one as a guest critic. Critics share their time and expertise on what the museum looks and feels like from the perspective of a newcomer. Cash payment ensures that critics leave the museum with a currency that holds value across all intersections of race and class within our capitalist system. The program was created by a small independent group of visual artists and researchers. The first iteration took place at the Museum of the Rhode Island School of Design, a comprehensive art museum in Providence, Rhode Island. Critics were paid with institutional funds from various academic divisions at RISD. The program was advertised in English and Spanish on public buses, and a final 41 participants were selected. Priority was given to those who had never been to a museum, along with people of color. Historically, museums have sought to enlighten and civilize a public. Look at Art, Get Paid asks, how can the museum be enlightened by those who are not presently served by it?
I'm from the North End, and it's pretty isolated, so you come down here, it's really busy, and it seems, the word bougie, I guess, and you come down here, you think, it's just artsy kids, and they're gonna look at you all weird because you got your Jordans on and stuff, but I'd say once you hit Broad Street on a certain side, nobody's really coming downtown to see, because I think the museum, you gotta pay $25, $45 to get in, which really isn't the case, but they don't know, so they're not gonna look to go down that avenue.
I've lived in Providence good 40 years, and I never knew this was a museum. And I come by this street a lot.
So I never felt like, oh, okay, I guess it's not necessarily not a public space, but maybe it's just not a space for me.
I'm really glad that I did come today because I was like, I never knew. And there was a picture by Jean Metzinger over here, and there wasn't enough big paper to see all the things I seen with that one photograph, but I will take a picture and send it to Walgreens and put it in my living room and post the size. That picture just kept calling me.
I get closer to some of the pieces, I'm like, stupid tea kettle thing or whatever, you know what I mean? Like, what the hell is this? And then I'm like, wow, there's such cool little, like, art in this. And I'm like, maybe it's not something that I would have bought or something like that, at the time or even now, but as a tea set, but as a piece of art, it would be something cool.
And then there's just another thing that I did ask one of the guards. You know that table, I'm sure a lot of you liked it, that's out there? I asked him if you could purchase, if anybody, there's rich people that might come to the museums and have a lot of money. And I said, if I ever win the Powerball, I'm coming to get that table. So I asked him, can you purchase any of the displays? And he said, no. But when you got money, I'll work around that. Just saying.
The first thing that happened to me was I went and set off an alarm. I wasn't even doing anything. I just was looking, I was leaning too far and the alarm goes off and I'm like, oh my God.
I just am so afraid that I'm going to do something wrong. I don't want to mess with anybody's art. I don't want to break anything. I don't want to be disrespectful. So I'm really hesitant to like interact with things unless I get something telling me like it's okay.
Because I really didn't see like a lot of inner city people here, only just like people who, you know, can afford pieces like this in their house or go to these schools. If like somebody who came here, you know, just Spanish speaking, they wouldn't know where to go or like what any of the descriptions were saying. And I felt like, oh, you know, that could have been me or anyone.
Because I was just looking at them, I like it or I don't like it, and then I stopped to read them. And once I read them, I actually liked it a lot more.
Yeah.
So the more I read, the more I understood, the more I enjoyed.
Te capto el nombre y la fecha, pero se supone que es algo histórico que por eso está aquí, pero eso no lo puedo captar.
Encuentras el autor, encuentras el título, pero cuando vas al año, tú te confundes porque el autor tiene un año, el título tiene otro año, y cuando tú lees la historia tiene otros años, tú dices en cuándo se hizo.
Tú sabes, si tuviera como ciertas palabras clave, hasta en inglés, uno podría deducir. Ajá, aunque fuera en inglés, pero que uno puede deducir que es por el poco idioma que uno...
Claro.
O no sé si es que el museo está dirigido a otro tipo de persona.
For my personal home culture, no, there was no like representation.
Same.
I mean, because I'm Afro-Caribbean, and I didn't see much African art, and I did not see any Caribbean art, or even Caribbean artists really being represented. So, for me, if I were to go to a museum and I see that stuff, that automatically excites me and stuff. But I didn't
see any. I'm Cuban, so I didn't see any either Mexican or Central American.
I'm Dominican, and I would have loved to see anything Spaniard or Latin American. Heck, I would have been happy with seeing something even from Brazil. I understand that, you know, like sometimes it can come down to the cost, but it feels weird given that Rhode Island has such a high population of Latin American culture that there's very little representation, but yet constantly there's this talk of, you know, everyone's equally represented, or hey, we're all for equality. I think it has to start with art. Art is like our most intimate expression of who we are as people, and I'd love to see just more international work, period.
It was just like an everyday thing for me. I'm going outside, I walk up the street, and I see tags on the floor, on the ground. I'll see tags on a mailbox, and it's just, who is that? What are they about? You know, their street credibility, so to speak. And it's just, going through a museum, it's the same thing. How highly regarded is this artist? Even looking down there, there's graffiti right there, and you could just see it on the wall, and you could just go down the stairs or, you know, look at high art, I guess. And it's just, who dictates where art should be?
And here are your 2 guest passes. Come back.
$75 is a lot of money to serve people. I mean, even now, you can get a lot with $75, but at the end of the day, there are paintings that cost $15 million or a painting that'll cost $25 million, and then they're sitting right in front of you, and it's just puts things into perspective.
To help me like get to the next point in my life, to be able to move forward and just, you know, have some extra cash in my pocket, whereas I really needed it at the time.
Tal vez si no me ofrecen que me van a pagar, tal vez no vengo. Pero después que estoy aquí, como no la pasamos bien, no podemos escapar.
Most museums were built and curated under white leadership and center white narratives of history, value, and beauty. The RISD Museum's mission states, "We aspire to create an accessible and inclusive environment that builds meaningful relationships across all communities." An overwhelming majority of critics said they were moved by their visit to the museum, and yet their sense of belonging was limited by the museum's collection and the cultural standards of the space. The creators of the project are working to communicate the critiques of the museum to those in power. They are also seeking collaborators and partners to connect to the larger community of artists, activists, and museums working to effect structural change in art and its institutions.
should give them a hand. Yeah, so thank you very much for that. It's always so good. I think I learn more every time that I watch that video, actually. But I'm sure people would like to maybe start at the beginning and talk about, what inspired you to do this? Why museums as a site?
Yeah. Josephine, do you want to do this or me?
Sure. So Maia and I both happen to come from families where we did attend art museums growing up, and I think both felt comfortable in these spaces and felt like they were ours. We also both went to college, in my case undergrad, in Maia's case master's program, studying art, and so felt at home in these spaces and to various extent had kind of committed ourselves to making work and being a part of the contemporary art discourse, but also both felt a real trepidation and I think a sadness about the present and historic centering of whiteness and affluence and of college-educated folks within our chosen field. And so this project came about when we were both students at the Rhode Island School of Design, wondering about how we were going to chart each of our paths within our chosen field, and thinking about how might we, as artists, try to make work that in a way posed a kind of point of entry for other folks into conversation about art. So I don't know if you maybe want to add to that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think our backgrounds just, I had studied Indigenous community radio, so I had been thinking a lot about public space and about the act of occupying spaces and the act of putting one's opinion out there and the risk of that. So, and then Josephine too has spent a lot of time sort of thinking about, I mean, you can talk about a little bit of sort of what you did with doctors and thinking about that kind of knowledge.
Yeah, so I have, as an undergrad, I studied science and technology studies, which is sort of a history of, and in many cases brings in practices from anthropology and sociology in looking at science and looking more broadly at practices of sort of deciding how folks decide who to trust or what knowledge constitutes truth or authoritative knowledge. So I had, as Maia mentioned, I've worked with a variety of groups, including doctors, and kind of mapping how people decide who to trust. And I think as an art student, I felt very strongly about the institution and the practice of critique, and this is where my friendships in many cases felt most vibrant and where I felt like I was able to be generous with my peers and where I feel like I received tremendous generosity from my peers. And so this act of talking about art objects and sharing space with others and sharing space in the room physically with art objects, which is something that happens specifically in museums, like these are the public spaces where that can happen, is a practice that I felt really strongly about and continue to feel strongly about. And I think that's, in my background, or why that particular exchange felt like an exchange to kind of explore or to try to open up.
Yeah, and Josephine, I think building upon your work with alternative systems of knowledge, something that we've talked about is how this project critiques who gets to produce knowledge vis-a-vis the museum. And so I would love if you could talk a little bit more about why you designated your participants as guest critics and what the impact of that critique is.
Yeah, so I mean, I can speak to, for us, we were thinking about the art critic and about the practice of critique and about who who gets to be called a critic and what sort of experience is necessary for someone to have that term, to possess that title. And so for us, we sort of conceived of the project in a place of thinking about the lived experience as a valid basis for critique. So not necessarily having a background in art, but wanting to sort of play with the institution of critique, with the sort of format of the artist, the critic, the critique, the group crit, and sort of occupy that and subvert it a bit in that way.
It's interesting in thinking about this question of who has the ground or has the license to engage in critique or to engage in knowledge production in a contemporary art or in an art context, especially thinking about that as it parallels or in some ways doesn't parallel what that looks like in other fields. So say in science, where the kind of primary way of denoting a given text or a given idea as kind of bona fide is for it to go through peer review and to be published in a peer-reviewed publication. In the art field is, while no doubt incredibly impenetrable, it is deeply unregulated, and there actually aren't clear ways that you necessarily that someone actually is licensed to speak to the meaning of our work and someone isn't. So, or I should say, the way that licensing happens is really opaque, and is also has to do with very insider cues about who has the position to go through a formal art education is maybe the most straightforward way to get to that point of speaking about artwork or producing knowledge about artwork. But there are other pathways, and there's also more required than just an art education to at least have platform to speak to the meaning and to engage in the interpretation of artwork. So I think it's also interesting to think about in this context, like what are the things that you need to have in place in order to have a platform to engage in interpreting art, and how do we, as artists making work about that space, use everything at our disposal in setting up these circumstances to also call out what those kind of barriers to entry are and what the kind of signifiers are that grant someone that microphone.
So what are some of the standout pieces of feedback that you received? And I know we witnessed some feedback, but specifically, what does it say about race, class, and museum accessibility?
Yeah, so from the pilot that we did at the RISD Museum, so we hosted 41 critics, we advertised in public transit, so we ran an ad alongside sort of like sleep studies and like, smoking studies that people were being recruited for, and so we sort of positioned it alongside those advertisements.
The ad ran, does going to an art museum sound like work? We'll pay you.
Yeah, so that was sort of the proposition. And then from there, we got 200 inquiries. We rounded it down to 40 critics, and we gave priority to folks who had never been to an art museum, as well as people of color, and low-income folks, as well as disabled folks. And so, folks left outside of dominant museum viewership. And so we basically had folks come to the museum. We greeted them with sort of reception, sort of as honored guests to the institution. And then in the group critique, a lot of the sort of critiques that came up and the questions and problems, they were really wide-ranging. So people spoke to, the silence of the space, the weird ways in which people don't interact, the sort of general feeling of the architecture, how sort of power is conveyed through architecture, as well as, the approachability or not approachability of the guards, depending on what the language one speaks. Obviously, as you saw, lots about sort of the labels and like whether one feels like they're penetrable or not. And I think what was important about it was that for us it wasn't necessary when we then presented to the RISD Museum at an all-staff meeting, and the feedback wasn't, that we gathered wasn't, groundbreaking. These are all sort of things that we know are difficult about museums, and things that a lot of folks in museums are present here are working on a lot. But then for us, it was a question of really how we as artists could set up this scenario where we might galvanize existing equity initiatives, and how we might sort of confirm what often becomes abstracted or sort of speculative in sort of audience research studies. So for us, it was really like humanizing those experiences through this. I mean, one of the ways was through this video, but also through publishing the critiques. And I think in future iterations of Look at Art Get Paid, we're really interested in actually like having a critic who's interested sit right where we're sitting and talk about it, so that it's less mediated.
And to give an example of the kind of conversation that came up at that all-staff dialogue, we had a exhibition designer who spoke to, after seeing this video and hearing the critics speak to their experience in the galleries, looked back at a decision that they had made to match the mannequins in the museum's 20th century gallery to its white walls, which at the time the person described as feeling like a strictly design decision, like narrowing the amount of information in the room and keeping things consistent. Looking back at that decision, seeing it as glaringly not a neutral choice, or a choice that clearly would impact certain viewers, and that is located, that has social and political implications. So that's the kind of shift that we would be that we're looking to, and that we have heard from staff is kind of where this has impact, as Maia said, rather than in surfacing, whole new domains of access issues that they're not already, aware of, and that aren't already on their to-do list. That this project was a way, especially for folks who don't interface with visitors daily, and especially for staff who don't interface with visitors who may be first-time visitors daily, that this was a chance to hear from folks directly in a way that wouldn't happen organically, and that was an emotional experience, and an experience that maybe shifted where something fell on a to-do list, even if it was already there. So we actually, the museum staff in the graphic design department, for example, pretty promptly after this all-staff dialogue, managed to get these brochures translated into Spanish, Mandarin, and Korean, which is something that they already had as an effort, but which amidst the really heavy caseload that so many staff at cultural institutions face hadn't happened yet. So that's the kind of that's some of the ways that we've gotten feedback about this operating at RISD.
Yeah, and I think to echo what both you and Maia are saying, these diversity, equity, and inclusion conversations have been ongoing in institutions. They're not new. And so what I'm curious about is how you situate yourselves as artists and this artist process or project within that systemic change process. So what about framing this as an art project empowers you to disrupt or either be part of systemic change?
Yeah, I think so. One of the things that we've thought a lot about is like the strategic positioning of where we locate ourselves. So we have a lot of friends and peers and folks we admire who are working decidedly outside of art institutions, and then And then many people who we met through Museum Action, so museumaction.org, Mass Action, Museum as Site for Social Action is this group of radical museum workers, many POC museum workers who are really fighting for institutional change within their institutions. So for us, I think locating ourselves sort of at that intersection of the institution and the public, and straddling, sort of utilizing our bureaucratic fluency, and putting in the time of like all the admin work that it takes to sort of hear what's going on the inside, and also hear what's going on for people who aren't included, and then try to sort of be in that way a pathway, open that kind of path for communication. So I think that strategic positioning is one thing, but then I'm also recalling what Carol said, which is also like systemic change. So I think the cohort model, maybe do you want to speak to that?
I'm going to back up for a second. I want to make a clarification about what we're talking about when we're using this language of talking about folks who aren't at the table or folks who aren't part of the conversation. We are, so there are, given big picture demographics about who historically white dominant cultural institutions have centered, it is the case that the demographics of folks who aren't centered in these spaces and aren't current visitors does skew POC and does include a higher proportion of folks who are low income and who are living with disability. That said, this project is, that said, I just want to clarify, that there are certainly folks who are, there are, like, as we all benefit from daily, there are folks with disability, there are low-income folks with low-income backgrounds, there are folks of color who are at the center of these spaces and who are working within them and who are writing vividly about all of this. So there's an overlap there in what we're talking about, and in terms of like that is a focus of ours and a feeling of loss and a desire to make more space there. But there is also like the specificity here lies not only in this being a project that centers POC and centers folks who are low income and folks with disability, but that this is a project that is specifically making space for folks who aren't making the choice to come to these spaces. And that could be for a variety of reasons. And that the central kind of action that we're taking, or the central kind of premise that we're starting with, is that it doesn't make sense to expect folks to do the labor of entering these spaces and speaking to what needs to change about them for free. And that it doesn't make sense to ask people to enter these spaces and do the labor of thinking through what might need to change about them in a way that requires them to assimilate. So that's the sort of, more specifically, that's the intervention that we're making, and that's the position that we're taking. And it does have overlap with these bigger demographic questions, but there's a piece of that we're taking on.
Yeah, and then I guess just to address Carol's question about systemic change is that I think we consider ourselves like a part of the puzzle, and so I think we have experienced a fair amount of like, how are you going to change the institution? And I think for us, it's like, we're as intimidated by that as everyone else, but also are interested in what piece we can play in it. So something that we're working toward right now is that from the RISD Museum pilot, we became very interested in like how might we build in some more systemic or cross-institutional change. So we're currently, what we did at Haverford, and what Haverford the residency gave us time and space and funding to do, was really research and develop this model and think about how to build it across a cohort of art institutions. So right now we have leads with Massachusetts and Philly, but we've also been talking to New York and DC about what it might mean to do this at 3 to 5 art museums simultaneously, to really create that sort of accountability, sort of public visibility, et cetera.
Yeah, and I think that's really great and exciting to hear about this project continuing and iterating. And I am curious about what are some of the changes or outcomes that you saw at RISD, and if those are and if you're looking for similar changes and outcomes when you start to initiate that cohort model. I think you had talked about artist commissions, right?
Yeah. So right now, we're in sort of the final phase of Look at Art Get Paid at the RISD Museum, which has been, in being experimental and us juggling other jobs too, has been going on for a little while, and we're finally sort of wrapping that up, and we're doing so by we're commissioning local artists in Providence to make art interventions that sort of engage the critiques that were produced through Look at Art Get Paid by the critics. And so those art interventions that we're commissioning will be at the museum and will be advised by critics who did the program. So that is a way that addresses several desires. One, to see like how art might weave back into this, so how art might respond to the information and the critiques generated, how there might be collaboration between the critics that we spoke to, and sort of looking at having an ongoing relationship with people who are interested, and then also how we might, how artists might propose some ideas for these questions. So one artist and critic team is doing an intervention on the museum's website that overlays some of the not written and drawn knowledge produced by the critics over the actual institutional website. Another artist critic team is working on an intervention into signage, collaborating with like auto dealerships to think about other forms of advertising the space and making it clear that it's open to all. And then there's another intervention where folks are doing a sort of workshop with the guards and engaging questions of surveillance. So those are that's another element of it that I think has been a really interesting way of going beyond just what was produced or talked about.
And part of just building off that, I think part of the delight and also just the learning curves of moving through the past few years of this project with you, Maia, has been thinking through and feeling out the various roles that we can play, and also the designations that we claim or the promises that we claim. And I think thinking through how we position this work in relation to institutional change, as you are bringing up and you're asking about, is something that we have put a lot of thought to, and that our position around has evolved, I think, as we've worked through this project and as we've kind of felt out, okay, how does this project live if it is claiming as part of its core function to have a kind of built-in accountability process with the institution? What is that?
And this element of change management, like how to help an institution change. And Carol, we had talked about sort of how much does the artist address in this transformation too. So I think for us it went from sort of like, we're gonna let's really call it all out, and to then being really humbled and being like, okay, well, what realistically can a gesture, even if it's fleeting, like a reversal in knowledge, flows of knowledge and capital, do? But I think something we're also doing in this cohort model is that we're building is working with some audience researchers and sort of radical museum consultants to identify points in which the critiques generated by Look at Art Get Paid can actually contribute to the greater movement of what sort of is in museum world conversations has been called DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. So making sure that we sort of are positioning ourselves in tandem with that work, because so many of our mentors and because so many of the people that we're allied with are working on these issues from a different field, be that museum consulting or research or scholarship.
Yeah, and what has been the sort of lasting commitment that you've received from RISD's staff when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, or maybe the commitments that some of these cohort institutions are starting to make?
Yeah, and I think no, it's a great question. In the case of the RISD Museum, it's important to note that this is work that the institution has been prioritizing and that has been rising in the institution's order of priorities prior to Look at Art Get Paid taking place. So this is a shift happening at a much larger scale that this program played some ultimately unknowable kind of part in. And so what we can speak to is, I can speak to the kind of energy that I felt in the room after that staff dialogue and feedback from POC staff, as Maia mentions. And hearing from the director, making that priority to put first in line acquisitions from POC artists, and these kind of commitments like that, expressed from staff. And the museum has, one of the things that critics brought up is, how should these objects be here? What does it mean to have, human remains in a museum? What does it mean to have objects that are outside of their cultural context in the museum, objects that may, and in some cases have been stolen within the museum? And that's a concern raised by critics, and also absolutely not a new concern, a concern that's been raised for decades, if not centuries, and that there's a rising pressure from across a wide range, both internal staff and organizers making these, pushing for these, and we're speaking now just after the publication of this report, commissioned by the French government into restitution and what that will look like for France. But I'm bringing this up because one of the changes is that the museum has made a commitment to initiating a restitution process with one of the Oba, so that's the head of the King of Benin. So these are masks that were stolen from Benin and that are within collections at prominent museums across the world, but in the Western world. So that's one very concrete thing that's happened that we're certainly not the only or primary source of pressure from. But
and then I think also another sort of point of that is with staff who I think a lot of staff spoke to us who don't interface with the public, who aren't in the education department, who aren't on the floor, and I think Josephine spoke specifically with some development folks who said this actually did really change and ground what had otherwise been abstract. But we have seen through that a lot of changes to not just the brochures, but then also the guards wearing very sort of direct changes, the guards wearing sort of the languages that they speak, and the museum starting to advertise in different areas that aren't sort of predominantly white areas. They've also started, I think, something we also talked about was that POC staff actually this sort of provided a context in which that this topic has been continually prioritized because of the ways in which we've followed up with the museum, and because of the ways we've asked sort of what have the effects been. So yeah, I think those are the main sort of things that have come up.
Yeah, I'll just briefly speak to the development point, and then want to step back again and thinking about like what are we talking about when we're talking about impact. In the case of some development staff, speaking to seeing this really concrete example of what it looks like to center a different kind of expertise, and in their case thinking about how can we do that in other ways, or how do we do that when we're inviting speakers, or when we're also looking to the array of materials at our disposal in crafting statements about what our institution does and the nature of our institution. And one very concrete thing is development staff have used language from Look at Art, Get Paid critics in grant writing, I also think it's this interesting. First of all, it's very complicated to talk about a attribution of any kind of causality in this case. It's nuanced, and these are issues that are being galvanized and that are shifting in a lot of different directions. And I also think it's interesting for us, coming back to your question about how we position ourselves as artists. This is an interesting and different kind of conversation than I've ever had as an artist about any other piece that I've worked on. Like, I haven't been asked about the impact or the kind of changes that have resulted from any other performance or sculpture or object that I've worked on or situation that I've created. And I think it's a delight and to be asked that as an artist, and a privilege to be asked that as an artist, but also an awkward position to be asked that as an artist. And I think that's something that we're also that ultimately is in our court, is how do we position this? And in addition to having conversations about what changes have resulted from this work, it's also in our court to position this work as an artwork and to provoke questions about its aesthetic or moral significance, or to have those kinds of conversations about its implications. Yeah.
And can I just jump in one more thing? I do think this did change. We did have really generative conversations with the museum about the implications of using cash to pay folks. So it took about a year to get sort of negotiations to really get to the point of having the approval to use cash and pay people in cash. So at different points it was suggested to use sort of student artworks from RISD students, and I see you grimacing. And then also we talked about gift cards and all these different ways of dictating value. And for us, what was really important was saying no. We want it to be cash. It also can't be a check because not everyone has bank accounts. There were some folks, several folks who didn't have bank accounts who participated, and so for us that was I think a really productive conversation to be having with the institution was, what does it mean to ethically, respectfully engage someone's knowledge, and acknowledge the labor, both physical, emotional, psychological, intellectual labor that goes into really crossing a boundary. And what does it mean to sort of leave it open? Who are we to say how you should spend your money? You've spent this much time doing this work and giving feedback, and so for us it was a really long and productive process to really rethink, have that conversation about labor and about money at the core of this whole project, Look at Art, Get Paid. So I think in some ways that kind of back and forth was a site of really having the institution come around to and reckon with what it means to ask for feedback and what sort of labor is involved in that, and how to properly acknowledge the reason they need feedback to begin with. And so I think that was a huge part of the sort of process and the effects of the conversation.
Yeah, and going forward, I am curious if you anticipate addressing like similar like particularities. By that I mean with exhibition design, with the restitution conversation, or if there's any particular topic that you are prioritizing when you're thinking about assembling this cohort and taking them through that process.
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point, something that has been important to us is that we're developing, working with institutions that are ready and poised to make changes. So for us, it's sort of a lot of wasted time on many people's parts to, and it brings up ethical questions of what it means to ask for someone's feedback and then not be able to really show that it's been valued and considered. So for us, that's one of the sort of criteria that we are using is making sure that we work with institutions that are actually excited about this and that are actually all the way through leadership. So not just education departments who are already working really hard on these things, but through and through that that we're working with institutions that are ready to consider the feedback really seriously and ready to consider those critiques and possibly make some changes. So to your point, I think one of the big things in our process is focusing on is really spending some time with the institutions that we work with to identify points of flexibility, to identify existing initiatives that we can support. So a lot of museums have diversity task force or committees or inclusion or accessibility committees, and I think for us, we really are going to tailor the project to be able to dovetail with those and actually perhaps position it so that it can be maximally sort of impactful, while also recognizing that we're not there to be museum consultants and tell them exactly what to do and follow them through the change management process, because there are folks we know and who have mentored us who are really prepared to do that kind of work.
And I think as we're conceptualizing and figuring out how the kind of potential and making sure to seize the potential for Look at Art, Get Paid to generate really practical knowledge for the museums, we're also at the same time at the root of it holding space for conversations about art and about art institutions that aren't premised on already having chosen to come to them or already feeling welcome to them. So that in its essence, the gesture in and of itself doesn't prescribe a certain end result. So we're also, part of that is also modeling and creating an opportunity for a critical conversation that takes place outside, already being initiated to a space, and that's something that I think we also hope will be beneficial and will be useful and provocative at that institution and in that community, is to have felt what that felt like to have a critical conversation that didn't start with that premise, and I think we're also both at each institution interested in feeling out how hosting Look at Art, Get Paid there might have potential utility in thinking about how to make similar critical spaces at other points or at other touch points in the future for that institution, and also more broadly thinking about how do we publish on the practices that we're using to facilitate these conversations, and how do we, as Maia referred to, partner with folks who do have that specific training in either evaluation or in change management to capitalize on that knowledge at that specific site. So kind of navigating a lot of different kind of systems of value and a lot of different kinds of currency. Yeah.
Right, and so maybe one last sort of large question before opening it up to the audience. How do you navigate this tension in the project between a critique of the institution, but at the same time, I think, asking for a buy-in from the institution?
Yeah, if anyone has the answer to that question, please let us know. But I think for us, it's been a process of that has been exactly the challenge is also asking museums to invest and to put in money, and also recognizing that there are consulting agencies that would say, like, we're gonna make change at your institution and stuff, and for us it's really part of it is valuing that work, but then also saying there's a lot of things that can be that are actually embedded and knowledge that folks have from their lived experience. And so I think for us, asking what we're discovering, I mean, to get to more of the nitty-gritty, like that we do need external funding, that it can't fully come from the museums or the institutions, that is too risky a line item to fully fund, but that what we're doing now is working with sort of cultural councils and cultural alliances in Philly and Boston to sort of address some of the costs of launching this, and then also asking museums to contribute a smaller amount than the full cost of it. So that sort of is a very detailed or specific response, but it is sort of the question of funding, which all of this comes down to, and this question of redistribution, like where does the money come from that we are using. So yeah, the buy-in. I think the buy-in is hard, but I also think we are capitalizing on the nebulous sort of valuation of critique that art does celebrate, and so we are sort of saying, like, hey, like, we celebrate critique, right? Like, all of us, and like, if we really do and we want to have some new conversations, this is what it takes. So it's a fine line, and I think it's something we're figuring out, but really, like, appealing, in that way, it doesn't take much convincing. It's more about how to, but when it comes down to funding, it is about sort of making it, making it affordable enough to the institution to be willing to take that risk.
Adding to that, Look at Art Get Paid begins with a very humble student project that came out of an interest in, how can we, as students with access to institutional funds, do something playful and something that we haven't seen exactly before at our institution, and came about really as an artwork, more as a performance even than as something than as an intervention with an agenda, and has received a degree of generosity that I just feel so blessed to have happened to be in the right place to get from just a absolutely staggering and deeply thoughtful and committed group of folks who have been instrumental to making this what it is in its current iteration. And Look at Art Get Paid as it exists right now and as it exists moving forward is deeply informed by museum staff and by folks with extended histories working within museums. And we, as artists, have a very particular privilege of working closely with museum staff on a project where they have very specific, medium-specific talent and experience and intuition. So we are engaging the stuff of public programming, and we get to work with folks who do that daily and who bring an extreme sensitivity to the politics of that, to the nuances of how that happens, to the pathways that a given program can take within an institution. So just, bringing that, circling back, both the project as it exists is so deeply informed by the generosity and inventiveness of museum staff and museum peripheral folks, who have mentored us. And in conversations that we have with museums, we're getting to creatively think through what this could look like with folks who are deeply invested in the potential for imaginative programming and who do that in their day jobs, anyway.
Yeah, and I think that this, in some ways it's like, only in art can you be saying like, hey, can you help us? Can we sort of get some funding so we can all be self-reflexive and we can critique this place? And then I also think like it is artistically like really an interesting exercise in sort of interrogating the elasticity of an institution and really like looking at what that building looks like from the inside and the outside. So I think it's also, to the credit of all the people who have taken the time to talk to us about it and to strategize about how to get it up to leadership and to strategize about how we approach it from different angles. It is innately collaborative beyond the two of us. So
Yeah, thank you for that. So I think now would be a great time to open up to audience questions.
Yes. Hi. What you just said, what that building looks like on the inside, and what you just said about what that building looks like on the inside and the outside. This is why I came. I'm an architect. I teach history of Philadelphia architecture, and I teach architectural design studio. And it's occurred to me, I've observed that a lot of my students do not feel comfortable going just anywhere. And I send them out to do an analysis of a building, and then I realize that they don't feel like they can go into this building. And so I'd like to hear what you think about what the building, if it's a museum, should look like, on especially the outside, just so that they could even get to the inside. And maybe extend that discussion a little bit more to public space and how we can make more universal public space. Any thoughts?
Thank you for that question. And it's a wonderful and rich experience that you're speaking to of as an educator and as a professional, inviting folks to do a site visit and then finding out as part of the feedback from that site visit that in fact the premise of the visit itself was untenable, at that time for that student. Speaking personally, I myself don't have ideas about how these spaces should look, outside or inside. My point of reference to this conversation is really through how to set up the conditions to hear from folks about what that could look like. What I can speak to is a bit about how we oriented our guest critics before inviting them to move through the museum and to take it in and then to report back. And so I think there's a real parallel in inviting students to do a site visit and in how we kind of oriented our critics. And for us, that looked like we actually printed out a handbook for each person, which is available on our website. And in that handbook, we explain sort of our position, not as non-staff, but as members of the institution and its broader community, that being the RISD community, and as having an interest in hearing how this space looks to each of you as critics, but not having an agenda to necessarily convince you that it's the right place for you or that it's a place you should come back to. And we also we gave a kind of brief history about sort of why it would be legitimate to feel uncomfortable while in the space, just very briefly mentioning sort of the histories about who these spaces have catered to in the past, and acknowledging and naming that experiences of discomfort and of stress may well come up and are valid. Something specific that we did was have a break room that people could come to at all points. So the room where we hosted our orientation and our follow-up discussion was available at any point with snacks and just like as a place to take a breather. And we also provided a kind of list of things that are and aren't permitted within museums, both to prevent people from having the stress of, say, touching something and then having the guard, approach them, and then also a list of things that you are allowed to do, just to grant some permission and to have that conversation not feel so constrained. And we also then provided kind of a list of things you could pay attention to or ways of looking.
Yeah, I mean, I also think for a lot of, and this is apparent in studies and things about visiting cultural organizations, is a lot of the critics said, now that I've been here, I feel like I can bring a friend, or I feel like I know the ropes so that I could come here if I wanted to. That doesn't mean that they're coming back, because it might not be the place they want to go to, but just how important that initial invitation is and how important that initial experience is. So, I mean, we did speak with the critics for half an hour beforehand to really field so in a lot of ways, we rooted it in the personal, and just saying, we want, the material of our practice is relationships in a lot of ways, and so how can we create these relationships where we're really making space for the anxiety, the shame. There's a lot of shame about, not having visited a museum before. And a lot of fear about, how to get there and what door to use and how to sort of look like what you're doing. And so in that way, that's not exactly something you can sort of scale up, but I think for us, having those intimate conversations was really important. And then another element of it was that we have been talking about is a lot of institutions just very sort of fundamentally the aesthetics, even if there's an ad saying, the museum, RISD Museum, if it's this solid block color with this tiny text and this big artwork, it's who is going to read that and see that and decide they want to come. So also a talk about aesthetics and about design and about the very sort of coded ways in which things are shared or made open to the public.
Very briefly, another thing that came out of those interviews that we did initially was a list of things that people were concerned about when visiting. And one of those was being alone. So we made time after our orientation for those who wanted to partner up to find someone else who wanted a partner to move through the institution with. Last thing. Oh, yeah. We also handed each person a clipboard, which folks spoke to as kind of...
Sometimes it feels good to hold something.
Yeah, and to have something that kind of that indicated a kind of purpose in the space or a kind of authority to take notes or to, document their process. But what I was gonna say is, I think just naming the elephant in the room and dealing with it head on. And I think that's how CASH operates for us. And also in terms of the space and the politics of space, we made our break room the museum's boardroom. So the place where the critics met was the same room where the RISD Museum's board meets. And so it was important to us to just like use the most kind of like high-end institutional room and just get it over with and just occupy it and like, and kind of, and just, you know, deal head on and speak head on to that discomfort and make space for just talking about it. Yeah. Thank you for the question. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm wondering about, like you say that the relationship is kind of the material of the work, and I'm wondering if after you've worked with the critics, if there's, it sounds like you followed up with them for these commission works, but I'm wondering if, you know, like the critics, like if you were reaching out to them or if there's an ongoing dialogue that happens after their role is kind of finished for the day?
Yeah, so there were some critics. We wanted to make space for people to just show up and do it and never talk to us again. And then we also wanted to make space for people to like continue to talk to us and for us to be able to continue to talk to them. So the commissions is one of the ways in which we're doing that. Something that I think we want to make more space for in future iterations of it when we launch it, this cohort is making direct lines of communication and staging direct encounters between for those critics that are interested, facilitating sort of unlikely exchanges and encounters where, you know, the critics meet with the curator and, you know, the critics speak at an art conference and, you know, with us. And so I think for us, it's in thinking about, you know, there's part of transferring, part of like shifting power dynamics is like utilizing your own and then also like seeding that. And so I think for us, we would really like to get to a point where for recognizing that that's like a not everyone would want to or feel comfortable talking to a critic, talking to a curator, that we do make those opportunities for that engagement. So that's like a goal of ours in really thinking through how to make it a more meaningful, continued engagement for those who are interested.
And just briefly speaking to the arc of the commissions, so the critic will be meeting and essentially meets with the artist at multiple points. So there's an ongoing kind of exchange and conversation guiding that artist through their decisions and being present for critical kind of decisions and course adjustments in the production of the work. And so that's something that we're interested in. And what does it look like for both for what does that relationship between the artist and critic look like, and then how does our role operate as a kind of facilitator of that?
Okay, so my question pertains to, so before I ask my question, I want to say that I really admire the work that you're doing. And thank you so much for doing the work that you're doing. And now moving on to my question. So you have this project that facilitates access to institutions, but those institutions themselves have mechanisms with which to introduce access to underrepresented populations, quote unquote. For instance, I went to Haverford, and part of the reasons I was admitted to Haverford was because I immigrated from a third world country. And so Haverford really wanted me at their college because I had come from the quote unquote third world and I was poor and I was a person of color, and I came to their college. And that's how I was introduced to art, through Haverford College. But I'm wondering how your project relates to, but also sometimes comes up against structures that the institution already has. for introducing the populations that you're hoping to introduce to these institutions, right? Because I'm sure that places like the Whitney or the MoMA already have like educational programs that are like meant to like, I don't know, create access to them, right? So like, how do you question the tenets of those programs? And then how do you think that what you're doing right now is different from like what the Whitney and MoMA does to bring in like, I don't know, people of color and low-income people into museums?
Yeah, so we've thought a lot about that, and thanks for bringing it up. I think we're sort of always on really on really tricky grounds when talking about money, art, labor, access. Like, those are just in whatever room we are, whether we're with the institution or the critics or here, it's like, I mean, we're sort of like walking into like just a confluence of so many sort of power dynamics and like problematic, like inherently always sort of weighing. There's no, just, I feel like in a lot of ways the project is comprised of all these problematic dynamics, and the question is like how to navigate them without just resigning and being paralyzed by them. So I think for us, one of the question of programming, yes, I think different museums have different levels of programming and types of programming, and we've got program folks here in the room, so I would love to hear what you have to say as well, and I have heard some of what you have to say, what you all have to say, which has been great, like really getting down to the nitty gritty. For us, like Look at Art, Get Paid engages people who often fall outside of the demographics that public programs. So there's a lot of youth programming, teen programming, sometimes family programs. There's sometimes paid teen programs. For us, it's like, what about the adults who maybe don't fall in that umbrella, or what about the community partnerships that a lot of museums have, but sometimes lack structure, right? So that sometimes like are there formally but may not be exactly activated. So for us, it's like in that Venn diagram, looking at the people who aren't already addressed. And then I think a critical shift for us is a pedagogical shift in terms of the, education. Like, we do our best to communicate that like we are not an education program and we are not here to educate about the museum. We're here to actually be educated by the people who come. So that's another sort of distinction in, why people might come to a program and who might come to a program. Yeah.
Just briefly, another part of this is dovetailing with really strong programming that already exists. So in Massachusetts, for example, one way of working with teen programming that we're looking at is potentially collaborating with teens who have gone through a documentary production workshop and engaging them in shooting the videography and doing the videography, to document the program, and working with them to edit and tell the story of the program. So that's
so yeah, not to be as critics, but to be involved sort of in another way. Yeah. And we will be, so one of the things that we will be doing is like present, at certain museums, we're presenting to the community partners to really talk to them about, what the actual, like, what their read on it is. So I think finding ways.
Their read on the project.
Their read on the project, yeah. So finding ways to really engage what is already there. Because, we don't want to just duplicate it. I think in each case it will be different. Does that answer your question?
I have a quick question. I'm just curious about, as you form the model, maybe I missed something, but as you form the model for this project, did you carve out a sustainable niche for yourselves to be employed, or how much is this sort of like a perpetual act of generosity on your part financially?
Yeah, we're transitioning into being paid by Look at Art, Get Paid. But yeah, it would be, getting artist fees. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing your work and telling us all about it. I kind of have two questions, if that's okay. So one is, if we're to think about your project as an art project, should we or shouldn't we think of your critics as performers for hire? Performers for hire? I'll just stick with the one question.
Okay, so just to
that's interesting.
Yeah, just to reflect back the question, and then I'm going to pass it to you, Maia. The question is, if we are to think about Look at Art, Get Paid as an art project, should we think of the critics as hired performers?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and like all the questions, is like really fraught too, because of what it means to instrumentalize folks, and I think for us, we sort of there's an interesting like tension between like a performance being like planned and sort of like and orchestrated versus like the earnestness, also trying to be earnest in our engagement with critics, so not sort of having them wear like critic suits or like, you know, like also not wanting to sort of make it too performative. Like first and foremost, I think our priority is the like orchestration of an experience that feels respectful, and so I think there are many elements of like making the critics perform that wouldn't feel respectful, but I do think that there is a level of performance that maybe operates at a different scale of the work, which is what does it mean to sort of, I do think there's this performance piece aspect of it where, you know, for one day or for a few days or for this month, these institutions are reversing flows of knowledge and capital, and where there is a cross-institutional sort of imagining of what it might look like to subvert systems of oppression and marginalization. So I feel like the performance maybe operates at a distinct level, or that's something that we've conceived of. Yeah.
Just very briefly, my initial answer would be would be no, insofar as I don't think the critics backing up. My answer would be it's something that we strive for in this work, to be transparent about the nature of the relationship that we're inviting folks to engage in. And my hope would be that the truth of that the status of a participating critic as a performer or not as a performer would reside in their description of the role they played, or that's how yeah. So if they identified the role that they played as performative, either because it felt in some way disingenuous, or in the context of a more expansive understanding of performance, if they felt that that vocabulary or that discourse described what they engaged in, I would go along with that read on their part. But yeah, but I would say if a person didn't see it that way, I would say that person wasn't a performer.
Yeah, I guess it also brings up an interesting question of like what it means to ask people, like there is a performative aspect of saying like you're an art critic. Like folks are like, no, we're not, but like we'll pretend to be, and like so we are sort of creating this imaginative scenario. So I guess in that way, you know, there is this role play, but I guess for us, you know, it's like that fine line between like asking folks to imagine something, but and asking them to I guess to perform the role of an art critic, to like to voice their opinions as they feel them. So yeah, it's blurry, but I think like for us, we're asking folks to imagine this, but we don't use the term like perform as an art critic.
And we're also at the same time as recognizing that there is a leap, we are also operating on the premise that this is the fact, that folks are speaking from a valid position of expertise in bringing their experience.
Yeah, that they don't have to like act a different way than they usually act to be a critic. Yeah.
Thank you for the question.
Yeah, I had a follow-up question, which was if you could just share a little bit about how you communicate that transparency about the nature of it being an art project, given that part of the framing of the piece is to, as you explained, as a kind of scientific, or posing as a scientific research project, or also having the guise of being a sort of audience kind of research project. Like, how do you like, just in the very practical ways, communicate to your collaborators that it's both an art project and that it also has this like, experiential, evidential nature that you want to have kind of bureaucratic repercussions? I don't know. Does that make sense?
It's a great question. Thank you for it.
And I think it's also, we got the cue for the last question too.
Okay, cool. One, maybe straight shooting answer is, I think for us, just trying to communicate like what it is that we're trying to do, the relationship we're trying to set up as accurately as we can. Like what is the nature of what we're doing, outside of whether it gets categorized as an artwork, as a study, as a part of a change management strategy. I think that's the simplest kind of thing at our disposal. Speaking to the way the project occupies some of these different existing categories, we drew upon those categories and the kind of history that exists like within the framework of going through, say, institutional review board clearance or of a bus ad, not because we necessarily not because we necessarily specifically wanted to, not because we wanted to be those things, but because that was infrastructure that existed that we could draw upon, and in a way shortcuts that we could use to have this make sense and to have this take place. So I don't know if you have follow-up on that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and then I think when we introduce things, just saying like we are artists and we're, these are the things that we're trained in. These are the things that, this happening could be categorized as, and this is our goal. So I think really, ideally we show and don't tell, but I think we do, initially start out by just saying it flat out, and then really having a discussion about it as well. Like, are there questions? Does this not make sense? So I think just being really direct about it, and then from there seeing where it emerges. There were definitely folks who I think, read it more as an education thing, simply because it was like, I came to a museum and learned about this museum. But other folks, were like, well, it was a thing that I did to get some money. So I think in other ways it's that we can't exactly dictate what it is to people, and like that is an interesting part of the process, and something that we have collected feedback on is like, where did this land for you? While stating our intentions, whether or not, and then seeing like, if it did work out that way.
Would it be okay to just to take this last? We have one more question in the front. Thank you. Oh, they're almost there with the mic. Great.
I guess my question is about the interpersonal.
Mm-hmm.
I think that institutions ultimately are built by people, and I think that people have relationships with each other, and I think that institutions at the end of the day are built on the relationships that the people who build them are. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think that institutions have initiatives to introduce people who say like are not economically well off, who are not racially privileged. And I think that they also have systems that are meant to address when, say, racism happens, or when sexism happens, or say, like, when a violation of, like, I don't know, your right as a person on this planet happens. And so I guess what I'm trying to ask is, I think that a lot of the people who might enter this project might have a lot of distrust towards institutions, because historically they haven't been treated well by them, right? Like, so if you're poor, if you're a person of color, like, museums don't really care about you. And they only care about you once you've gotten a scholarship to some college. Or even then, they still don't care about you. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, how do you make space for the interpersonal in institutions? I feel like institutions don't want to talk about the interpersonal, because I feel like, I don't know, places like this museum or places like Haverford College that is funding this already have people of color who are poor and, like, from not the first world already holding space in those institutions. And they already can't make room for them. And it doesn't matter that they can't make room for them, because they're willing to bring in other people. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, how do we begin to acknowledge space and what holding space means on the level of the interpersonal? And what the interpersonal means. Yeah. It's okay. No. Yeah, I guess specifically also in the context of sex work, because I went to Haverford College, and something that no one ever told me when I went to Haverford College was that there were low-income students who actually did sex work at Haverford College to keep afloat. And so no one ever talks about, like, I don't know, systems like I don't know, people, like, just don't talk about sex work and things like that are supposed to be, like, super stigmatized. And so, yeah, like, I am at this, I don't know, conversation that was funded by this institution where all these terrible things happen, but that institution says that it's okay for all these terrible things to happen because they later fund people who share similar identities to me. And it's supposed to be okay because even if they ignore people like me, they later fund people who share my identities. I guess that's all I have to say.
Thank you for naming that and bringing that into the room. And I think there's a lot in what you just said that is on the money. And I think just given the time constraint of the space, we'll speak to you one-on-one afterwards. But yeah, just very briefly put, the questions that you're raising are pivotal, and I think the answers here are just in the space and agency that individuals within these institutions take and the various points of change that people take up, and the just long-term work that staff who do have the opportunity to try to make something budge take on. Briefly stating, I don't know exactly, we can speak to you after the fact, but also just noting that I don't know, in the midst of what you're describing, sex work is work and isn't necessarily necessarily in of itself a hardship. So just stating that there's of course many students face a difficult position in paying their tuition and in making it through college, and that there's all kinds of ways that hardship can reside. Yeah.
No, just thank you to Maia and Josephine for, I think, being so generous with your practice. And so I think if we could all give them another hand.
And thank you to Carol for pushing through this with a fading voice.